it's okay. So let me well, the title of the lecture, perhaps I should explain that. The and, at any rate, that joins legitimacy and justice. The paper is really about not legitimacy and, in addition, justice. It's really about legitimacy as distinct from justice. So I'm focusing on what, at any rate, I call legitimacy, and in particular focusing on it as a distinct concern from the concern with what I describe as justice. Now, the tags, the words legitimacy and justice, are both of them variously used, even in contemporary political theory. So my use of them can be regarded in a way as stipulative. What's really important to me is the difference between the concerns, however you describe them. So in order to get a sense of the distinction, the best way is to see there are just two quite separate questions you might ask, it seems to me, about a system of social order and law, a political system, in the domestic context. I'm going to abstract altogether from the international context in this discussion. So in any such regime, in any such order, there's a social order obviously imposed, an order whereby private law, public law, criminal law, they're all set up, and the various ancillary institutions of society are established, and we enable to live our lives together in certain relations with one another. Okay, and one question clearly about such a social order is, how good is it? How acceptable is it? How unobjectionable is it? Now, I'm going to just use the word just for that. I'm going to describe that question as a question of justice. How satisfied should we be with the social order that's imposed in a given domestic society? And I'm going to describe that as a question as to how just the social order is. But wherever there's an order imposed, there's obviously a second question, which is the question of, well, how acceptable is the imposing of the order? How unobjectionable is it? How attractive is it? How satisfying is it? The mode in which this social order is actually imposed. And I think of these as two, they're connected obviously in deep ways, but as two conceptually distinct questions. I mean, that comes out in the fact that you could imagine, this has to be heavily qualified, and I'm not going to enter all the qualifications, but you could imagine a social order that's really in many ways very satisfying. Establishes relations between people that, in whatever our favorite currency of evaluation is, we say it's pretty good. But on the other hand, the imposing of it, let's suppose, might be done by a colonial government, or by, in the traditional image, a benevolent despot. So the order imposed might be satisfactory without the imposing of the order being satisfactory. And on the other side, you can see, at least it's a conceptual possibility, that the actual imposing of an order, the way in which the order is laid upon on the people in the society, is, again, by whatever currency, and we'll come to that evaluation you have in mind, is acceptable, is okay. But yet the order that's actually imposed is not particularly attractive. Now, I think I use the word legitimacy about that particular question. So the question is whether the imposing of the order is unobjectionable, satisfying, or whatever. I think of that as a question of legitimacy. So I'll say that a social order is just insofar as it's, as a social order, satisfying, and I'll say that it's legitimate, or the regime is legitimate, insofar as the way in which it's imposed is satisfying or okay. Okay, now let me just comment briefly. I'll try to do this quickly, and it's a little bit dry, and I'm setting a stage, so to speak. So it doesn't have much brio to it, or swerve or gusto, this particular laying out of these issues. But this is how I think of them. The significance of the justice and legitimacy questions. They're distinctive because different things hang on the answers you give. If you decide that a social order is just, then, as I see it, you have got a content-dependent reason for obeying those laws. That's as distinct from the context-independent reason that you might have to obey any laws, which turns on the fact that the laws represent a mode of coordination amongst people, establish mutual expectations, and a variety of matters. Again, Joseph Raz has clearly blazed a trail on that particular topic. There are context-independent reasons for obeying the laws of many social orders, but if you feel if the laws are just, then that's a special extra reason. It's a content-dependent reason. The content of the laws is really pretty good. Apart from the fact that they serve the coordinating function, they have got a character that really gives you a reason for obeying these laws. So that's what hangs on the matter of, are the laws just? So what hangs on the matter of, but is the social order legitimate? Is the system of laws legitimate? What, so to speak, is the response required of us in virtue of thinking that it's legitimate in my sense? Well, let me just use a phrase for the moment. I think that what hangs on it is whether or not you accept the regime. So what's imposed on you by the legitimacy of a regime is that you've got a very special reason for accepting it. I'll come in a moment to explain what I mean by accepting it. Of course, there are other reasons why you might, in this sense, accept a regime, apart from the fact that it's fully legitimate. So, for example, there might be all sorts of contextual pragmatic reasons. Among them, for example, the reason that if you accept a regime, go along with it, as it were, behave as if it were legitimate, that can actually be a way of making it legitimate, or keeping it legitimate, or furthering its legitimacy. But putting those aside, there is a special reason that justice gives you, content dependent, to obey the laws. There's a special reason that legitimacy gives you to accept the regime. But now the question is, what does it mean to accept the regime? And in particular, what does it mean to accept the regime what does it mean to accept the regime in a sense in which that's distinct from obeying the laws? And I think that, the distinction between obeying the laws and accepting a regime comes out in the scenario when you imagine that there are various laws that are actually unjust, so you don't have a content-dependent reason to obey them. It may or may not be the case, in such a case, it may or may not be the case that you have a reason to accept the regime. Now, suppose the regime is fully legitimate. Then accepting the regime gains a content distinct from the reason to obey the laws, the content-dependent reason to obey the laws, and it's this. If you accept the regime, you think the laws are unjust. Of course, you may still have the context independent reasons to obey the laws, the modes of coordination and so on in the society. But if you think the laws are unjust, then it's very likely you think they should be changed. And so you think you've reason to do things in order to change them. Now, what it means to accept the regime, as I'm going to think of it, is that when you oppose the laws, if you choose to oppose them, as well you may, then you oppose them only within the system, as we said. That's what it means to treat the regime, the system, as legitimate, which is even when the laws are unjust and you want to challenge them, you restrict yourself to challenging them within the system. Challenging them within the system may mean, electorally, I suppose, challenging the government responsible for them. It may mean taking the government to the courts in various jurisdictions. It may mean protesting on the streets. But also, and crucially, from my point of view, it may mean civil disobedience. Now, in civil disobedience, you actually disobey the law. You break the law, either the laws you're protesting against or some related laws, but you don't reject or resist the system. You're not called, or the regime, because you're prepared to be taken to court and you are prepared to accept the authority of the court. And it's clear that what you're doing in civil disobedience is wanting to signal and express the depth of your objection to the laws. So therefore, this is the way I think of it. You've got the legitimacy of the system, the fact that it's being imposed is okay, the way it's imposed, is going to give you a duty, let's call it political obligation, which involves a duty, if you contest the laws, to contest them within the system. And I think of that as distinct from the duties that go with the justice of the laws, which will be a duty to obey the laws for a content-dependent reason, as well as the content-independent reasons that there may be for obeying the laws. I know that, as I said, I promised you it would be dry and boring, didn't I? I'm sure I've lived up to the promise, but the picture, I hope, is in any way clear. Think of it as I have a little, I think we used to call it my scholastic original training, analogies of proportionality, which is on the line at the bottom of the section headed political legitimacy and obligation. So the idea is that legitimacy relates to political obligation. That is the obligation to accept the system. That is the obligation, if contesting laws, to contest them within the system, rather than resisting the system, looking for regime change, looking for revolution, whether by violence or subterfuge or whatever it might be. Legitimacy relates to political obligation in the way in which justice relates to the obligation to obey the laws, which I call here legal obligation. Now, in each case, of course, there may be reasons to accept the system independently of legitimacy. As I mentioned, as there certainly are reasons to obey the laws independently of justice. But that's how they pair up with those two obligations. I find this reasonably sort of intuitive way of thinking for the following reasons. We think that the residents in any society or jurisdiction have got a duty to obey the laws. And that follows from the fact that there are context-independent reasons, but also, particularly if there are just laws, there's a content-dependent reason for everyone who's resident within the system to actually obey those laws. Would we only think of people who are citizens? Now, I don't necessarily mean formal citizens passing, but that's a category we extend in various ways, but I won't dwell on it. But we think that political obligation is owed specifically by those who are citizens of the society, not just, for example, people passing through. They should obey the law too. But citizens particularly have a political obligation to the system. And this fits nicely with my sort of setup here, because after all, it's only citizens who would have the power of opposing, at least in many respects, within the system, the laws. And so political obligation fits with citizenship quite nicely, where the legal obligation, the obligation to obey the laws, fits nicely with just residency. That's going to be enough, so to speak, for that obligation. Now, what's the problem of legitimacy? I'm just going to put aside justice at this point. And what I want to argue is there's a problem of legitimacy, and then there's a problem with legitimacy. And I'm going to invite you to move mentally to what I think of, many of us here think of, as a Republican frame. And then I'm going to show you what the problem of legitimacy is within that frame. And I'm going to argue that there isn't a problem with legitimacy within that frame of the kind that there is outside the frame. Okay, so what is the problem of legitimacy? Well, it arises from the fact that a social order is coercively imposed by the state, by the collectivity in some way. Because coercive imposition of an order, on the face of it, looks inconsistent with something we all, in different ways, under different interpretations, claim to treasure, and that is our individual freedom. So that, as it were, the first best version of the legitimacy problem is how can we think of ourselves as free if we live under a coercively imposed order? That's the first best version, as I call it, of the problem of legitimacy. There is a second best version of the problem of legitimacy, and it's often the version you see in the literature today, as far as I know it. And it seems to me to be second best in the sense that it's a problem that arises only when you've given up on trying to square coercive imposition with freedom. The second best version goes like this, as I've put it here. The problem is, in this second best version, is assuming that there has to be coercion. What's the best form of social order? Assuming that it's inevitable that there's coercion with all the problems for freedom that raises, are there any other marks of the way the order is imposed that makes it at least acceptable, so to speak, on this second line of argument? Maybe it's bad in freedom terms, but are there other terms in which you can see the imposing of the order as acceptable and therefore legitimate in that second best way? Now, I think the freedom question, the question of how can you square coercive imposition with freedom, is the primary issue in the following sense. Suppose that you had a way in which an order could be imposed that kept people's freedom intact, as you might put it. And then you've got another way in which an order might be defended, the imposing of an order might be defended, which says, well, look, forget about freedom because that's clearly ruled out by the way in which the order is imposed, but look at all the benefits it has. For example, contemporary Confucians argue that so long as it's meritocratic, there's nothing bad about the order. That's a second-rate, so to speak, theory of legitimacy. Or epistemic Democrats will say something, so long as it's a system that is reliable for detecting, better than any other system, the truths that are relevant in politics. That's a reason for thinking the opposing of the order is okay. But suppose now you had a choice between a system that's consistent with people's freedom and a system that, while it's not consistent with people's freedom, has this other characteristic of being meritocratic or epistemically reliable or whatever. It seems to me clearly you want to opt for the first one, the freedom-satisfying one, and that indicates, in my view, why the question on the problem of legitimacy is, first of all, a problem of how to square the coercive imposition of a social order with the freedom of the people who live under it. And of course, that's exactly Rousseau's expression of the problem, when in the social contract he says the problem is how a man can be both free and forced to conform to wills not his own. So that's my core problem that I'm dubbing the problem of legitimacy. You see it in various forms raised in that first best version to do. Also today, for example, in the work of Frank Michelman, he asks a very similar question somewhere, which goes something like, how can we claim to be self-governing if we're actually governed coercively by a state? They're just inconsistent on the face of it. And that's the, as it were, the core or the hard problem. Now notice, maybe I shouldn't dwell on this, but it seems to me someone like Aristotle, if you look at Aristotle's Politics, that problem actually doesn't come up, that problem of freedom, doesn't come up very strongly, because the way Aristotle seems to look at things is the following, and I think it probably influenced medieval thinkers a great deal as well. He seems to think something like this: look, what is it to be free? Well, that's to have a certain status of not being a slave in private life, so to speak, under private law. And he seems to think that, look, the state is perfectly natural, the polis. So you get families, you get villages, and you get the polis. And at what stage of social organization do you get the polis? Well, at the stage where the social organization becomes self-sufficient, as he puts it. And he seems to think that at that level of articulation, aggregation, organization, society, where it's self-sufficient, inevitably is governed by laws which ultimately are coercively imposed. But he doesn't seem to see a problem about that coercive imposition. So his main question is, and that's what he relates, actually, what we now translate as legitimacy to, is whether or not the order imposed is an order in which the common good is kept in mind. It's only perversions, so to speak, of mob rule, for example, or tyranny, that actually don't look at the common good. And any system, be it a monarchy or an aristocracy or a politia, as he also calls it later in the Politics of Democracy, that's all okay, provided it looks at the common good. So there's no real problem of legitimacy as I've just raised it. But that problem of legitimacy seems to me gets to be foregrounded in the more Roman tradition, where, as you might put it, freedom is politicized in the sense that people are thinking of freedom in such a way that it's really threatened by the way in which the social order, the laws and so on, are imposed on us. And so when Tarquin is thrown out of Rome, the great lore of the tradition becomes that a tyrant imposes a social order which, no matter how good it is, you might say, is still imposed by an alien will and therefore destroys our freedom. Now, once you think that freedom is at risk, is at issue in the relationship between citizens and the source of social order, you've got this problem of legitimacy, of how to square that imposition by central authority with the freedom of the individual human beings who live under it. I refer directly, with intent, as it were, to the Roman tradition, because I think it's important that the problem of legitimacy, as I'm thinking of it, is already alive in classical Republican thought, in the thought of, say, someone like Cicero. And it comes to life again in the later Republican thinking that draws on those Roman sources, like, for example, Machiavelli, who clearly sees that the freedom of citizens is deeply threatened not just by the relationship, so to speak, horizontally with other members of the society, but in particular by the relationship to those who impose the laws, right? So that there's a real problem of how to square the imposition of law with the freedom of those who live under it. Okay, now, what's the problem with legitimacy, as it were? That it seems to me has pushed the problem away from the center of political philosophy, allowing what I describe as the problem of justice to basically become a sort of monopolistic in controlling or requiring the attention of people in political theory, political philosophy. Well, I think the problem with legitimacy goes back to the way in which, for example, someone like Rousseau actually chose to tackle it. He has a clear sense of the problem. How can a man be both free and forced to conform to wills not his own? And of course, his answer is that this will be okay so long as people have entered a social contract, voluntarily formed society, formed unanimously consented to be governed by majority will, as he puts it. Ideally, a majority will that represents what he calls the general will of the society. Then, he thinks, and only then, will the regime, will the way in which the laws are imposed be legitimate, be, in these terms, consistent, as he thinks of it, with the freedom of those who live under them. The trouble with the Rousseauian solution to the problem is that hardly any of us thinks it could work in any of its many possible variations. So, for example, he's going to require that as a society continues, people continue voluntarily to consent to the order that they live under. That's going to be a precondition of the imposing of the laws on them being a form of imposition that's consistent with their freedom. But now, do we consent to the laws we live under, whether it be Rousseauian republic or a society of more electoral kind? And the answer clearly is no. Of course you would if you adopted a Hobbesian view of what it is to voluntarily consent to an arrangement. There's no problem, because you remember Hobbes told us that fear and duress are completely consistent with voluntariness. If I submit to a conqueror out of fear of my life, as the sword hangs over my neck, I say, yes, yes, Lord, you're the boss, you're the man, and so on. I am perfectly voluntary. I do that perfectly voluntarily, according to Hobbes, because of his rather unusual, you have to say, theory of voluntariness. All it requires is that the act is the product of belief and desire, never mind that those beliefs and desires are formed under fear of one's life. Now, Hume, in his essay on the original contract, he's absolutely spot on when he says, our use of voluntary requires something extra. If you voluntarily consent to X, it must be the case that there was an alternative Y that was a perfectly acceptable alternative. Serena Alzaretti has developed this in her work. Many of you will know it. Now, if you think there has to be an acceptable alternative, then of course, whatever you say about our attitude to our government, it can't be one of voluntary consent, because for most of us, there is no acceptable alternative. And that raises a real problem for legitimacy, with legitimacy. Because if you think of the problem in Rousseauian terms, which is the right way to think about them, as I say, but then you frame it as solvable only if you can tell a story about voluntary consent to the regime we live under, then you're coming up with a story that most of us will think is simply false. We don't consent. Now, Kant, who claims to follow Rousseau very carefully, actually breaks with him dramatically on this point. Because while he talks the language of the original contract, he talks the language of the united will of the whole people, having to be behind the laws that are imposed on them, as if he were going, the full distance with Rousseau. He quickly adds, but of course, the original contract is just an idea of reason, he says. By implication, the idea of consent is just an idea of reason. And what he uses the original contract for is to test about a social order, whether it's one, as he says, that could, I'm at the bottom of the first page, could have arisen from the united will of a whole people. he talks about this as a touchstone of justice, I would say, of any public law's conformity to right. Now notice at this point what Kant has done is said, look, forget about the problem of whether the order is imposed in an acceptable way. Just look at the order, It's a little bit like, never mind the quality, feel the width. Is that an Irish joke? No. Wasn't it the draper who sort of says, never mind the quality, feel the width? There's a lot of cloth there, maybe horrible cloth. Anyhow, Kant, he basically says, look, we should look in the laws and so on, whether these are laws that we could have chosen the original contract, whether they satisfy those constraints. And of course, if they satisfy those counterfactual or hypothetical constraints, you might well think, well, they're pretty good. But that's a test of justice as to how good the social order is. It doesn't tell you anything about which ways of imposing that order are acceptable and which not. And of course, Kant notoriously ends up saying that it really doesn't matter how the order is imposed. You never have a right to resist. As he says, no matter how tyrannical, the way in which an order is imposed, no subject has the right to resist the sovereign. So he focuses completely on the problem of justice. And as I say here, enter Rawls and that long retinue of theory. I mean, Rawls is a wonderful, great figure. I'm not for one month running him down. But he follows in this track, because of course, as he says, he's a Kantian theorist. His test of how good the laws are, the basic structure is whether or not it would satisfy a certain counterfactual test. He's using something like the original contract, but as an idea of reason, not as a historical sort of story, as Rousseau was gesturing at. And what he's saying is that let's look at how satisfactory they are insofar as they pass this test, and the problem about whether they're imposed on us in a way that's acceptable. Well, it gets some treatment in Rawls, as we know, but I would say it gets what I think of here as a second best. The problem is cast in a second best way. That's maybe something can come up in the colloquium tomorrow. It's not something I can really address now without taking up too much time on it. So with Kant and with Rawls and that whole Kantian tradition, the problem of legitimacy gets really gently pushed aside, and we just to focus on what I think is the problem of justice. But the same thing happens, of course, in the main rival to that tradition, which is the Benthamite tradition, the utilitarian tradition. Because in that tradition, you're invited to focus on basically how much utility or happiness or whatever is being produced by the system of laws, and you're not invited at all to mull on the question of how the laws are imposed. In fact, Paley's great follower, Bentham's great follower, William Paley, explicitly says, focusing on what makes a system good, that really, so he takes freedom, and now it's freedom in the sense of non-interference that John mentioned, that Paley has in mind. He says about a system, the best system in the world, the system that might deliver the most freedom, he says, could be a tyranny, a benevolent despotism. It need not be, he uses the word, a democracy, for example. So again, as in the Kantian tradition, the focus has shifted entirely to how good the social order is, away from the issue about how acceptable the imposing of that order is, how legitimate, in that sense, the imposing of the order itself is. And of course, in response to that, people like A.J. Symonds, for example, responds by saying, look, there is no solution to the problem of legitimacy, because he accepts fundamentally the sort of framing of the problem, the freedom-centered framing of the problem that I've been putting forward here. And what he wants to say then is, look, the only sort of way of solving it, as he sees it, is along the consent lines or some variation on the consent story, but there is no plausible consent story available, as Hume already pointed out. And so he says, we really have to accept that in the contemporary world, most of us live under, well, at least in my use of the term, illegitimate social orders. And, we just have to forget about that, and let's look at the quality of the order, in my original joke, the width, I suppose, of the order, how good the social order itself is. Okay, now I want to invite you to switch to a Republican frame of thinking, if that's not too much of a demand on your imaginations or sympathies or whatever, maybe doing violence to your otherwise natural inclinations. because I want to suggest that if you move to a Republican frame, the problem of legitimacy remains a very sharp problem indeed, actually, a very telling problem. But at least you can see, in principle, how it can be addressed and how it might actually prove to be feasible. Now, I'm not going to take you into how I think it might be actually addressed. I'm just going to try to show you, persuade you that, in principle, it can indeed be addressed. Now, when I talk about a Republican frame, for these purposes, there are many strands, of course, in the Republican tradition, many of them concerned with the institutions whereby freedom, for example, might be secured politically, but I'm going to focus on what I see as the core ideal of freedom in the tradition. So let me just very briefly present that. Think of it first as an ideal, although that wouldn't actually have come naturally to people in the tradition, but think of it for analytical purposes first as an ideal of free choice, an ideal. So on the Republican view, what is it for a choice to be free? A choice, let's say, between X and Y, philosopher's favorite sort of example. When is it that I choose freely between X and Y? And on this approach, I choose freely between X and Y when the presupposition is I have the resources independently to make the choice. We'll talk about what that is, if you like, later. And the important thing is I have the resources, the wherewithal to choose, and I can choose between X and Y independently of what anybody else wills that I choose. So in choosing X or choosing Y, I need not pay attention to what other people prefer that I do, to what other people will that I do. In that sense, I enjoy, what Algernon Sidney in the 16th century called independency upon the will of another. It's got to be the case to enjoy this freedom, obviously, that the other doesn't say, take away X, you can't do that, you can just do Y. Obviously, you're going to be, in that sense, unfree, or takes away X, Y rather than X. Or maybe imposes a penalty on it, thereby changing the nature of the option to penalize X, penalize Y. Those are modes of interference, or perhaps deceives me about the choice, thereby making it impossible for me to choose. Those modes of interference by another will, in the normal case, certainly be ways in which I'm rendered unfree in that choice. Would equally suppose, and this is where the differentia, as John said, of the Republican approach, or at least one of them, suppose that this person has a power, all the epistemic and objective resources necessary to be able to interfere with me. And I have a choice between X and Y. And imagine that this individual is so kindly disposed towards me, is so favorably disposed towards me, that he's happy to let me have my way, to choose either X or to choose either Y. In that case, on this Republican conception, I'm not free because I depend on the state of his will, or her will, remaining a good will, in order to be able to choose between X and Y. Should that person change, so to speak, their preference and turn nasty, then I'm going to be actually interfered with. So just to have a power of interference, just to act in the presence of such a power of interference, is already to be unfree because you're dependent on the will of another. In that sense, you're subject to the will of another. Just to make that vivid, think of, I'm sure I've used this before, I hope not in such an event, but think of, say, Nora and Thorvald in A Doll's House, where Thorvald is a doting husband with all the legal power, right, of a 19th century Scandinavian marriage. And Nora is clearly subject to his will, but he's doting. He gives her everything she wishes. In fact, she can do anything except eat macaroons, but those she manages to hide in her skirts anyhow, right? So she has perfect leeway in the choice. But however, she hangs on his will, because should he cease to be goodwill, should he move in that way and have a preference for her not doing this or that, then he has the power to do it. So she depends on his will remaining a goodwill, and in that sense she's subject to his will, and in that sense, in her choices that are relevant, where he has the knowledge and the ability to interfere should he take against her, she actually is not free in that choice. That's the core sort of notion of freedom of choice. Now, in the tradition, the focus is mainly, as indeed Quentin Skinner has emphasized in particular, is mainly on free persons. What is it that makes a person free? Analytically, I reconstruct this roughly as follows, that in the tradition there's a notion, first of all, of what you might call them the important choices in life, what John Lyburn in the 17th century called the fundamental liberties, what we call the basic liberties. Now, there are many ways of spelling out what those are, and I have a particular take on that, which I quite like, but I'm not going to present it here. Let's just take it for granted we have a sense of what the basic liberties are. I also think, by the way, they're going to be variable in many ways, level of specificity anyhow, across different societies and jurisdictions. But let's just put that aside. Now, in the tradition, a free person, when reconstructed this way, is a person who, in the exercise of the basic liberties, in the exercise of those choices, is publicly resourced and protected. Now, publicly is important, on the basis of public law or whatever, is publicly resourced and protected, so that in the exercise of those choices, he or she is not subject to the will of others. So the free person is someone who has a, so to speak, a public force field surrounding them that makes them, this is going to be a matter of degrees, very importantly, that makes them more or less immune to the power that others might exercise over them in that range of choice. That's what freedom of a person is going to consist in. Just think of it, I think this is a sort of operational test for whether someone is a free person. And I think it's true to the tradition and the way it talks. The idea is this: how do you know whether someone is a free person? How do you know whether they're adequately resourced and protected in virtue of public law, etc., so that they don't choose in subjection to the will of others? Well, you know it insofar as they have the capacity by local standards to look others in the eye without fear or deference. Now, clearly, that's going to be socially, culturally sensitive in various ways. But it's, think of it like the test that Amartya Sen uses of poverty when he says following Adam Smith, actually, when he says that to not be poor, or to be poor, is to have to live in shame before others, right? Not to be poor is to be able to live without shame. This is in the same sort of, the same spirit, I want to say. A good test of whether someone counts as a free person in this sense is whether they can look others in the eye without reason for fear or deference, at least based on the fear of their capacity to interfere with them, and that on the basis of a public and therefore manifest resourcing and protection that they enjoy, or at least a guaranteeing of resources and protections against others. Okay, so the idea is a free person, someone who can walk tall, doesn't have to bow or scrape, and all the traditional imagery comes on stream here. So that's what I think of as the Republican frame, that focuses on one of the great sort of things that the public order can do for individuals is make them into free persons who, in this sphere of the basic liberties, have this public level of resourcing and protection sufficient for them to be able to live, so to speak, in this attitudes of without fear or deference towards others. Now, what I want to ask, if that's what freedom is, you can see what the legitimacy problem is going to be. It's going to be the problem of whether people could be free persons in that sense, enjoy that, so to speak, assured status vis-a-vis others, and yet be subject to the coercive imposition of the very order that perhaps protects them in that way. Does the coercive imposition in some way take from that freedom that we've just spoken about? Well, now, obviously, and this is going on the section called the Republican problem of legitimacy, if you do take this view, then you're going to say, well, look, if you live in a social order that may actually be quite good at protecting and resourcing you against other individuals in the basic liberties, but that is imposed, say, at the will, even at the goodwill of a benevolent despot, someone who could change his or her or its mind, so to speak, then no, you don't have freedom, because now you enjoy these choices you make in the basic liberties only dependently on the will of the benevolent despot. It's only if the benevolent despot stays goodwill, stays favorably disposed towards you and your kind, that you continue to enjoy this freedom. But that itself, this range of choice, but that itself means that those are not choices in which you enjoy freedom. You are not a person who enjoys freedom in that social order, because there's, so to speak, a rottenness at the core, this dependency of a political kind on the, for example, the benevolent despot. And also the question is clearly whether there is another way other than benevolent despotism in which the social order could be imposed on us, such that under that mode of imposition, under that style of coercion, we would actually still retain our freedom. And we'd have solved Rousseau's problem as to how a man or woman can be free and yet be forced to conform to the wills of others. That's the question. Can we save freedom in that sense? Okay, so while the question becomes quite a sharp question on the Republican approach, therefore, it doesn't go away, and incidentally it arises whether or not you buy into a state of nature sort of staging of the problem, and that's actually important for me. So, you don't have any truck with the state of nature. There's still the problem of whether we, the subjects of a regime, could continue to enjoy freedom in this Republican-rich sense while being subject to the coercive imposition of law. Okay, so now I'm going to suggest that if you do think of the problem in terms of Republican freedom, if you accept that Republican version of the problem of legitimacy, then there isn't a problem with legitimacy of the kind that I said there was on other approaches. It at least becomes a problem that, in principle, looks tractable. And I'm going to, I can tell you briefly why that is the case, and then I'll try to illustrate it in a little greater detail. Of course, you might think, well, it won't be tractable because we can talk the language of the general will, like Rousseau, and say that, well, under certain conditions, the will behind the law is actually a general will in which we all share. I actually think that's a wholly suspect idea. I have no sympathy with it whatsoever. I just don't think the bus is going anywhere. So I'm going to take quite a different approach in answer to it. And I begin by saying there are two conditions under which the restrictions that a state imposes on us are not dominating. And this is the clue to why the Republican approach makes the problem tractable. If the state imposes restrictions on us, but they don't in any way reflect an alien will as to what we should do, but rather derive, say, from necessities, whether of nature or history or culture or whatever, then they're not going to represent restrictions that impose another will on us. They're going to be like the restrictions of, well, to take an extreme example, gravity. We're not made unfree in the Republican sense, perhaps any sense, by the existence of gravity. And similarly, I want to say here, the freedom of a person, as I've defined it, is consistent with state restrictions that themselves, so long as they don't reflect the will of the state or those who run the state towards you or towards your kind. So the second observation I want to say, and this follows from the Republican way of thinking, is that equally, if someone interferes with you, thereby exercising a will towards you, would you control that will? You impose terms and limits on how that will operates in your life. Then that need not be a dominating form of interference. You can have interference that's not dominating, in other words. Classical sort of example, Ulysses and the Sirens. Ulysses' hands are tied by the sailors and they maintain them. They keep them tied, keep him tied to the mast, even as he screams to be let off. But few of us would think of that as, at least assuming that he's got power over the sailors or whatever, via maybe his mates on the ship. Few of us would think of it as a dominating form of interference, because they're not imposing their will independently on Ulysses. On the contrary, they're almost, as you might say, channeling his will. Certainly, they're only free to operate and interfere insofar as he allows them. So in that sort of case, the interference is not actually a dominating form of interference. So now with those two observations in the background, let me wind up in the final 10 minutes with two steps, as I see it, in seeing how, at least in principle, the Republican version of the problem of legitimacy can be resolved, so that you can keep the problem of legitimacy on the table of discussion rather than letting it go, so to speak, go away, as in more standard approaches, and yet see a means of properly tackling it. Okay, so the first step is this, is that there is a lot of state restriction, which while it may seem to and does involve interference by the state in our lives, is not really a form of domination because it reflects necessities rather than an independent will imposed on us. So, for example, a certain sort of state of nature theorist, I suppose, might think that I'm free because I just have to live in society. I've got to live with other people. Well, clearly, the state doesn't force us to live with other people. What forces us to live with other people is, well, a number of things, but in the first place, biological necessity, that we are born into society and there's no way out of that, so to speak, and the fact that there are a few areas of wilderness anyhow that you can get away from other people. So that you're immersed in social life is not a form of domination by the state, as if it could have done anything else, and released you from this domination. So that's not a worry of a legitimacy kind. But here, secondly, some might say, well, look, I've got to live under a state. I've got to live in political society. I don't want to live under any coercively imposed laws of any kind. And the state keeps me under those laws. And indeed, it does interfere with me by imposing those laws. So isn't that a case of the state dominating me? Well, again, I want to say no, because it's a product of history. It's a fact of just how our species has evolved on this planet, that all of the earth is now state-bound, is governed by states, and that our particular state is the state we live under, doesn't reflect a will on the part of the state to keep us living in a state-bound existence. There isn't any other form of existence possible, and that's not the result of anyone imposing on us, dominating us, standing over us like the master and the slave. But thirdly, some might say, well, look, okay, so I got to live in society, I got to live in political society. I can see that's a matter of biological and maybe historical necessity, nowhere else to live. Well, why do I have to live in this state, right? Doesn't the state keep me here? Isn't that a form of domination? Well, again, think about it. Assume that the state gives you freedom of exit, which is certainly a prerequisite. Why do you have to live in this state? Well, it's because other states won't let you in, necessarily. Well, why won't other states let you in? Is it because of a will towards you in particular? Are you of kind? Well, no, because states, as a matter of what I call your political necessity or sort of functional necessity, have got to have closed borders. You can't maintain a state, I would say, and have just open borders. Anyone welcome. You've got to have closed borders just to have it function as a state. So that the fact that you have to live in this state, or at least you may have to live in this state, is again a product of a necessity. It's the functional necessity on the part of other states to maintain relatively closed borders, as distinct from just open slather. Or someone might say, well, wait a moment, but why do I have to live on equal terms with others? I'm going to have to go quickly here because I want to end on the hour. Why do I have to live on equal terms with others? Which is, what the best states in any case impose. And I would say, well, does the state really have a choice in that matter? Would we really think that any other sort of regime where some were special, as in the ancien regime or whatever, is a feasible sort of possibility? And the answer, I would say, is no, and that you can't, so to speak, hold it against the state, that it's not giving you the special place you think you want, be it that of a zealot or an aristocrat or whatever. The state is forced, more or less by necessity, the way it operates, at least our sorts of state, to treat people as equals. It's the first, I would say, normative constraint in how a state operates. And then someone says, well, wait a moment, I'm quite happy to obey the law, given it's just and so on, and I think that the laws around here are just, but what I want to do is to be able to obey the law just on the basis of agreeing with it, just on a, so to speak, a voluntary basis, rather than being forced by, a stick held over me. Why do I have to be subject to a coercive imposition of the law, rather than a consensual acceptance of the law? And I would say, again, product of functional necessity. assume, as I guess all of us do, that there are always probably some people in the society who won't comply unless there is a coercive law. And even if that's not true, assume at least that most of us believe that there are some people who won't conform without a coercive law. And that gives a reason for having coercive law, either a reason of ensuring compliance of those individuals or providing assurance to the rest of us that those individuals will conform. But now if the state has to coerce some, and if by the prior observation it has to treat everyone as equals, a state, I would say, is required in the nature of things to coerce everybody. It can't just select. It's not feasible. In any case, those who need to be coerced and let the others, sign up on a purely voluntary basis to it. So the fact that we live in political society in this state rather than any other, and under a coercively imposed regime, all of that is the product of a mix of historical, political, functional, natural necessities. And you can't look at the state and say, you're dominating me, because here I am. I've got to live in political society. I've got to live under coercively imposed law. I mean, that's not a complaint, so to speak, that you have grounds to make against the state. You can't complain on grounds of legitimacy that therefore this is inconsistent with my freedom. Okay, so now that's the first step in a solution, I think, to see that if you adopt this frame, and it won't be available if you think freedom is non-interference, but if you adopt this frame, then, so to speak, the requirements of legitimacy condense. They don't become as expansive as they are in other ways of thinking, and they're consistent with the necessity of living a political life. So what are the demands? And clearly, and this is to go to step 2, they're as follows. The state does exercise discretion within those necessities or those constraints. It exercises discretion in choosing the particular laws it chooses, in imposing the particular way it imposes them, in having taxes and penalties of this or that kind. It's got a whole range of discretion. And so if that's an untrammeled discretion, an unconstrained discretion, then clearly in the exercise of that discretion, we depend on its exercising goodwill towards us, or so it seems, and so our freedom is compromised in the Republican sense of freedom by the existence of such a wholly discretionary state. But now I said there was a second way in which restrictions by the state need not be dominating. That was if they're controlled by those whom they affect. Like Ulysses controls the interference of his sailors in his life, and so their interference is not dominating. So here you can see the idea is going to be to see if we can design institutions such that the interference of the state in our lives is controlled by us, is allowed only on our terms, in the ways in which the interference of the sailors is allowed only on Ulysses' terms. And of course this is a big demand, because it won't be enough, so to speak, if we collectively impose terms, because some of us individually may not go along with the collectivity in the agreement on what terms. So there has to be a system of control by the people over government in which everyone equally shares. And now you can see if you had a system of government such that people controlled under that system, controlled what government could do, imposed terms on it, and people equally shared in that system of popular control, then that would be a way in which you think this state is a legitimate state. This state is a state such that its imposing those laws is consistent with our freedom, understood in the Republican sense. We are free persons, can be free persons, not just in the sense of enjoying private non-domination with the sphere of choice in which we're publicly guaranteed resource and protection. We're also free persons in the sense that we share in control of the very source of this order in our lives. Now here's the big disappointment. I'm not going to tell you, obviously, how we would get a system of such equally shared control. That's well, I suppose you do a bit of advertising. The book that John mentioned, which won't come out later this year, but early next year, I think, that's at least devoted to this particular problem and what I would want to argue, but you can see now why I would want to argue it, that it's not wholly infeasible to think of designing
a set of political institutions whose goal will be to give an equally shared form of control to people over the area in which the government exercises discretion. Of course, isn't it a sort of design specification for democracy? It's saying this is what we should require of a system that deserves to be called democracy, giving kratos or power or control to the demos, and in particular in an equally shared way. So what you get here is a Republican specification of what something truly deserving to be a democracy, that's to say a system that really would give people such control over government's imposition of laws that that imposition is consistent with their freedom. It gives you a research program. And that's the way I think of Republican political theory. It's not a sort of blueprint, it's not an ideology, it's not a set of answers. It's a way of thinking that can give you a lead, on an angle on, these age-old problems that we all face. But I think I'll stop at that point. Thank you very much.